In all honesty, I have no idea what to make this about. I've seen all the news, all this new philosophy stuff, and nothing has really interested me. Like necropolitics, I get it. I saw dialectic of enlightenment. Wasn't that important in all reality? I mean, yeah, it's culture. The cultural industry is just a, an idealistic, incorrect understanding of cultural dialect. But sure, yeah, whatever. Like, maybe I've just finished this whole thing. I still need to understand how to solve the cultural dialect as how I believe I've figured out for the material dialect, the whole thing. I think it's pretty easy if you instate. So Chile had a system of cyber socialism which worked through a planned algorithmic society which doesn't rely on things like people or authoritarian government to plan it, because authoritarian governments are prone to fall, just like democracy, into a sort of reactionary standpoint. Democracy and authoritarianism is very much linked in its shared aspect of reactionary nature. So they use more workplace democracy, which is different from normal democracy, because workplace democracy, the people know best in those subjects, but the people don't know best in running a government, however. Workplace democracy, they increase it with autonomous stuff and being able to, talk through in democracy as customers and proletarians alike. It's a very nice system, and all that really Chile was missing was the actual defense, a government to fight against America and the invasion. Like Castro said, the main issue was their pacifism, but everything else about their economy could have worked. I like the cybernetic socialist thing, and if they got rid of commodity production and commodity fetishism, they could have easily created a real socialist nation that would transfer into communism through the lack of commodity production, the later internationalism, because, they were Trotskyites. Not saying Trotskyites are good, but the international part is a very necessary part if you want to achieve communism. And the economy, how it was run with the cybernetics, was actually very useful to get away from the whole corruption of power and the issues of centralization with authoritarian government. It was actually very useful. But I have no idea how to solve any cultural dialect, because the material dialect, I have that solution for it. Just cybernetic, anti-commodity production, non-democratic libertarian nation. There you go, easy. But with culture, it's difficult. Culture works under a quasi-Schelling's dialect. I call it quasi-Schelling's because it takes from Schelling's understanding of dialect via in nature, not culture. And Schelling understood how dialect works in nature in a different way than he understood dialect overall. Schelling used Fichte's dialect in all reality, but I was inspired with how he describes the dialectic nature of, nature itself more than his use of dialect in the Fichtean sense, because he did use dialect mostly in the Fichtean sense, but how I use his dialect in nature is what I call the quasi-Schelling's dialect, or the cultural dialect. The whole growth, decay, and rebalance, the renewal of balance, it's a dialect that Schelling doesn't actually use very often since he's obsessed with Fichtean dialect, but he uses it in describing nature and how it relates to man and its growth and all of that. So in reality, it's quasi-Schelling, it's very inspired by Schelling's idea of how nature works. Culture is like Schelling's nature, and I think that's a very nice way to describe it with the absorption of its enemies. I think I might have worded weirdly how I critiqued futurism as a solution to the cultural dialect. Truly, it's because futurism doesn't solve the issue; it compresses it and makes it even worse because then the counterculture that comes out of the culture never really leaves the culture at all in futurism. It's like neoliberal. It's like neoliberal culture, but neoliberal culture isn't obsessed with violence and fast, more culture attacks, blah 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 blah. Instead, neoliberal culture focuses on keeping the counterculture in the culture in a moderate way. Instead, the futurists want to keep counterculture in the culture in an extreme way, forcing the counterculture to be as bad as the culture and have them be in constant war with each other, like an internet dialect or something. The internet, it's not a dialect online, but the dualism between the pro-shippers and anti-shippers, it's similar. It's the idea of constant violence and constant attack from two sides that in the end will never be resolved. Then when it does, they create a new issue and a new attack and a new thing. The whole thing is about violence and renewal, like palingenesis or whatever. Also fixing like the dialectics of material by saying, well, nationalism, we don't need to focus on class, while encouraging the nation to be constantly against itself, to be against the nation as a nation, to beat the new nation. Futurism is a death cult, basically. It's literally just a death cult. Nothing wrong with cults, but definitely something wrong with death cults, because, not really wrong with death cults. I mean, certain ones can be interesting, like Jim Jones, but like the idea isn't a workable political solution to anything. Death cults are not a solution to politics. So that's why, honestly, I cannot see futurism as the solution to the cultural dialect. But in order to even create a solution to cultural dialect, you have to understand cultural dialect. And to do that, you have to understand its quasi-Schelling's thing. Where did Marx get the solution to his dialect in his naturally Hegelian dialect? Because Marx did use a dialect. I call it dialectal materialism, even though that was a term made by Stalin to describe his pseudo-Marxist dialect, which wasn't real, the antithesis, the thesis, the synthesis, when Marx actually used the Hegelian dialect, which was thing, negation, and the negation of the negation to describe the bourgeois and the proletariat, and the negation of the system as a whole, and then the creation of a new system, blah, 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 blah. All of that, it's based in Hegelian understanding. Even his capital, his understanding of how money works is based in Hegelian dialect and Hegelian philosophy. But Stalin ignores this, not Marx. How does Marx create the solution to the whole thing using his Hegelian dialect? He creates an inversion, right? He says, well, if the whole thing is a system where there's a thing and it's negated by the thing that it actually negates, because he flips Hegel on his head. I interpret this as, instead of the negation being negated, instead of the negation being negated, first of all, it's a system of the thing and its negation that's negated in total. And also because in the end, the thing and its negation is usually like the bourgeois and the proletariat, which instead would really be the proletariat as a thing and the bourgeois as the negation of the thing that oppresses the thing, right? And the total system being negated into the new system would be the sort of negation of negation, which would lead to the new thing, the new being, which would be, I don't know, probably after feudalism it was capitalism, so that would be a new thing that has its thing and negation, which would be bourgeois and proletariat or something, and it goes on and on, So he uses this whole thing what if instead of going a new thing and a new thing that gets oppressed by this thing, you go take the thing that's oppressed and make it oppress the thing that's previously oppressive. Make the previous negation into the new thing, and instead of having it be a new thing inside of the new negation of the negation system, switch it around, put it upside down instead of just evolving it naturally. So he would have the proletariat over the bourgeois instead of the other way around, and even though the way it was supposed to go is that the proletariat, in some supposed forever Hegelian sense, like if it followed how the feudalist thing went, how capitalists overtook the feudalists and then the feudalists died, so the capitalists created a new class to oppress. Well, they didn't create a new class to oppress, but the system created a new class to oppress. It would do that. Instead of doing that, they instead had the system be renewed but flipped upside down instead of replaced with a new system. Socialism would be the upside down inversion of capitalism, not the replacement of it. That would be the solution, to stop the dialect as a whole and instead flip it upside down, to create a system that instead of dialectically evolving would slowly, gradually reform into higher communism. It would, instead of relying on the idea of evolution, it would instead take it into its own hands and create a system that naturally forms into its new shape. That's linked to Hegelian ideas in the first place and essence and all the Hegelian stuff. Quasi-Schelling's dialect doesn't follow that pattern. You can't simply just turn around the system of culture. You can't put counterculture first and have culture oppose it and the counterculture and culture just merge into the counterculture. That cannot work, because counterculture is dependent on culture as a whole in a way that the proletariat is not dependent on the bourgeoisie. Counterculture is only existent if it is oppressed by culture. It cannot exist without culture. It cannot exist above culture. It cannot exist bigger than culture. So culture has to stay the main center, or else it would not make sense. You can't have, and plus, even if that were the case, counterculture would just become the new culture, so it wouldn't make sense. It's really difficult to think of this stuff because I don't exactly understand Schelling's in the highest view, and the understanding of the growth and decay is very hard to put into practice if you want to do the opposite and stop this growth and decay thing, to permanently create a sense of stability where there is no more culture. The end of culture is really, really difficult to imagine. Like that one Zizek quote about capitalism. Although I do believe that capitalist realism is pretty real, alright, and people are mostly under the idea that, like Mark Fisher said, oh yeah, socialism is impossible. I think that socialism is possible because, Chile did it in its most pure form, and Vertiga explained how to actually achieve it via the words of Marx himself, and all of that, without it corrupting into authoritarianism. Although Vertiga was a technocratic, totalitarian idiot, his ideas on economy was entirely right. So combine those two and you would get real socialism. However, most people cannot think of this as a solution because they are under the guise of pessimism, doomerism, capitalist realism, all these ideas that kind of shorten it. And the perversion of politics in general. I hate political ideology. I hate all of these because it's all used by capitalists to push their agenda. There's no more, like the situationists. The situationists aren't always right about everything. They're barely ever right about anything. But they had one thing that was very much true, and it was most definitely the thing on politics, because ideology in general, all forms of ideology, all forms of politics, all forms of everything is mostly perverted. It's now about who gets to live and who gets to die. It's about reform. It's about not changing the system, but adapting to it. Or if you are changing the system for the worse or making it better in a negative way or a reactionary way, there's no longer any real radicals, and when there are, it's less about actually organizing or revolting, but instead just taking in political debate or educating the masses or trying to create your own sense of political identity or something. They lose it to this idea of power or identity or something to cure their depression or something, and not actual politics. Politics has been degraded very, very heavily. I don't really know what to say about that. Well, whatever. Politics is now about identity and people who think, I'm actually better than you, so let's make a system about that. And that's basically just a big summarization, huge overgeneralization of how politics works nowadays. Because I've never seen someone who genuinely actually understand, it's usually philosophy, like a mix between politics and philosophy that achieves any sort of actual realism. Like CSEC is not the best example of politics being revived into its original definition, because he is very, very, very nihilistic and doesn't do anything to actually, you know, help communism arrive. He just claims to make capitalism not as bad because you can't end capitalism. This is it. And that this is his fate now. He's kind of reactionary in that way, but at least he creates a mix between philosophy and politics that actually influences people to understand politics better in a way that isn't just identity and more power and more blah 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 whatever. It's influence of culture in general, because culture mostly is about taking advantage of identity and insecurity. That's how politics is doing now. Culture, just like it hijacked religion, because religion was a failed evolution of culture, it hijacked politics because politics is still revolutionary. Or reactionary if you want it to be, but usually revolutionary. I can't breathe. Damn. This shirt's too tight, sorry. Okay. I don't really know what to say, in all honesty. I couldn't find anything that actually interests me, and the whole thing about cultural dialects being kind of annoying, because what am I supposed to say? Seriously, what am I supposed to say? I can't find a solution to this, because it's something that hasn't been thought of extensively before. I don't think people understand how culture is mostly dialectal. I don't think I've seen a place that talks about culture in a dialectal way that isn't about the Enlightenment and culture as a result of the dialectal instead of the dialectal itself. It's just kind of, it's difficult. Or they'll try to split nihilism. No, nihilism is actually very good, but they'll try to put dialectics into like a sort of upper reality thing. Dialectic is not how reality works. Dialectics is not how reality works. Dialectic is how the mind works and how the mind construes certain ideas through its whole dialectic system, because the mind is dialectic. I put this in my identity dialects video. The mind is basically dialectic. When I say the mind, I'm talking about like your brain this time, not like the mind in the way I use it in the identity dialectics. I'm talking about the brain. Humans in general are dialectic. How they understand the world is dialectic. So, it's not about how the world works in general, it's about how we work. And we work in a dialectic way. That's why culture and class and all of these hierarchies and us ourselves work in that way. But society, the world, the laws, and how do I describe this? How the world works, how history works. It's not dialectic. Nature, history, none of those things are dialectic. If you go outside and you take a walk, you're not going to have any sort of negation or anything. You just kind of sit there. I guess. You know what I will never understand though? Delusionism. Okay, that's not how you call it. I call it that because I don't want to say its full name of God, whatever the hell this is. Hey guys, I'm gonna say it, I'm gonna cry. There's the easier way, no methodology or whatever. But usually what I hear from other people on like books or whatever, it's always something delusio guattarian. That's actually not that hard. Delusio guattarian. Yeah. Relating to or characteristics of the works of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. That's not that hard. Why am I crying over that? But I don't get it. Truly, I don't. I think it's idealistic nonsense because I cannot fathom any sort of non-idealistic take from this. There is no material in it. Like, I appreciate the inspiration from Lacan. I love Lacan. He's a great philosopher. I understand his ways through a dialectic system because, in all honesty, that's the best way I can understand it. I reject certain parts about his more Freudian ideas because, that's how fruit is. Fruit is wrong. So of course you have to take some things out of it if you want to truly understand a pure lack and understanding. Because he was inspired by other people, fruit, whatever. But that doesn't mean that you need to take every single thing that he says as fact, and you can discard the more Freudian stuff. You can discard it. That's what I'm saying. I don't know. I sound like idiotic. I don't know. I'm not a postmodernist. I'm just gonna say that here. I'm not a postmodernist. I don't exactly understand Deleuze because his idealistic nonsense doesn't make any sense, and his critique on dialectics, to what I know, makes no sense. Like I've read it again, and a third time I don't understand it. I simply don't, because it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I've read a lot of things that don't make sense to me, like communization theory. God, if I have to read that one more time, I think I'll cry. Yeah, no, I understand not even a word of it. But Deleuze especially, I don't get. Because it just... Okay. So he doesn't really make sense. Most of the ideas that I've heard from him are either really simple things like difference and the fact that in reality there aren't real opposites, only in like the mind there's opposites, and I agree. But again, all these dialect stuff is because only in the mind is there dialectal stuff. In real life, there's no real dialects. That isn't just, oh well, this is the house and everything outside of the house is the lack of a house. That's the only real dualism that exists in real life. Like, I made a post about this actually. Here I said. So I said a lot here actually. I guess I should probably archive this. I don't know. I'm less paranoid now. I don't think that things are gonna get taken out of. I don't think things are gonna be removed from my YouTube account. I don't think my YouTube account is gonna get banned. I think that's just something I was scared about at the time. Okay, so here's what I said here. The average understanding of dialectal materialism. Am I fucking stupid? That's not the one. I said something about... Oh, yeah. No, I lost it. Never mind. Okay, so it was in the description of one of my videos, actually. The only real dualism in this world that barely counts under my definition of dualism is the thing and the lack of a thing, which is what I meant by the contradictions in my understanding of Mainlander atheism. Not that it's black and white. Not that black and white are opposite, because it's not. Black and white are not opposites, but that things like light and the lack of light were being forced together because that unity of things and lack creates separation in a materialist view. This is different than the dualistic nature of mind and fictional things because it requires something else that is with a definition to oppose it to give it a definition, and vice versa. While the lack of a thing is not a definition, a nation is defined as both its people and the against, not lack, of its outsiders, because outsiders are still in the nation, but it's against. And outsiders would be people that exist against the nation in this delusion, but usually in real life are also as their own global identity, be it their own national identity, their own whatever. What I'm saying is that ideas in your mind aren't like the thing, the lack of a thing, but things that are actually defined and not things that are only really dependent on the other because of the lack area, right? For example, if you have a world full of grass, you kinda wouldn't know it's grass unless you had a lack of grass. But that doesn't really make sense as a dualism thing, because that lack of grass is not something else that the grass depends on, but just a fact of reality that the grass can only exist if there's something at least to compare the grass to, not like something that the grass directly needs to exist in a dualistic sense that has its own definition. Like, let's say in a hypothetical situation, grass and socks were both made up ideas, and they were dualistic, but in a real sense, not in the stupid, well, the lack of something is its dualism, no, but in a real dualistic sense where both of them have definitions and rely on each other. Grass would be both something that's green and something that grows, but also defined as not a sock. And that would be its key feature, that because anything that's green and grows wouldn't really matter in someone's brain, because let's say hypothetically, okay, so this is from a completely idealistic standpoint. Let's say hypothetically you saw nothing, you felt nothing, everything was pitch black, okay? There was nothing, not even black actually, everything was just pitch. And you imagine something that's green and that grows, that you can only really imagine if you see it through the lack of, no, not the lack of, well, yeah, basically in a way, the lack of, the against of socks, because socks would be something that's the opposite. It's gray, it doesn't grow, and it's soft or something. And they're both well defined, and it's not like they lack each other, because you can have green socks or something, but grass can only be understood in the opposition of socks. It's just as socks can be only understood in the opposition of grass, even though they both have their own definition and aren't the lack of the other. But in real life, in the non-dualistic world that people try to fake as dualistic, you have white and black, which black can exist on its own without white, because you can compare it to any other color in the world. The only thing that black needs to exist is the lack of black, which doesn't really count. The only thing that white would need to exist is the lack of white, which doesn't really count. But white can be compared to any other color, not just black. If black didn't exist, white would still exist because it has colors to compare itself to. This is different from the other definition, because in a hypothetical world where you need grass to imagine socks, without socks, there would be no grass to imagine because you have nothing to compare it to. Because it's directly dependent, unlike the lack that the real world has in its false dualism. I just wanted to say all of that because it's actually very important to me that people don't mess it up. Also, my post-Mainlander understanding of atheism, which I wrote down in my thing, I purposefully made it less deified, because Mainlander's thing was based upon pessimistic will and the idea that God would just understand what's perfect, and what's perfect would be him dying. But no, in reality, I understand God to be not a sentient creature, but a first cause. In reality, the world doesn't even need a first cause. But I do believe that, in a way, a first cause is kind of necessary. And since the Big Bang, to a degree, kind of has real implications, that I would make a philosophical understanding of the Big Bang and what I understand to be the cause of the world. That's my post-Mainlander understanding, is that, thus, my post-Mainlander understanding is that the thing we called God was the first cause. The stupid light turned off. Would be the first cause, right? It would not be sentient, but by definition, it would have to be all perfect to be God or a first cause. It would have to be. Actually, it's only that really, because all knowing and all present are both things that are disconnected to perfect. Being everywhere and being all smart are both just perfect attributes. So to be all perfect, it would have to be the compressed existence of everything at once. It would have to be every imperfection and every perfection all at once, because something purely imperfect is perfect, because these are both concepts that don't actually exist, and it would be the absolute. Perfection is just absolute, something that is pure something. So pure impurity would still just be purity. And it would have to be all good and all bad at the same time. It would have to be all lack and all thing. It would have to be every single contradiction both at once, but real contradictions, such as contradictions in the mind, sure, idealistic contradictions, which don't really affect God because I'm a materialist, but also literal contradictions in being both the lack of everything and everything at once. Those are things you cannot put together because it's a false dualism. I already went through in the false dualism. It goes against the laws of the universe to have something that's completely lack and completely thing at the same time. Therefore, as he is existent, as God exists, and he always has exists in this false narrative, and since he's not a person, this contradiction of lack and thing, which is the only dualism that really exists in the world that isn't in the mind, which is a false dualism, literally would shatter God apart. That would be the Big Bang. God as a contradiction of everything, falling apart because of the contradiction area, the separation. Because things that are lack and things that are things, if they were put together, they would obviously have to separate. So he would break apart. And that would be the first cause. That would be the creation of the world. That's how I understand Mainlander, outside of the Mainlanderist pessimistic religious understanding that he understands himself. That's my post-Mainlander understanding of the world. Yeah, I don't really have much to say. Blurb. Yeah. Bleep, bloop, bloop. Yeah, maybe this channel has to be put down to rest because I don't have anything to say, and I think I really finished it when I finished talking about Marx and identity and culture, and that's really the only three things I really cared about: the cultural dialect, the self dialect, and the class dialect. Those are like the three things united through hierarchy that really actually, creates the control that every idealistic thing, fictional thing has on reality. It's mostly just culture interacting with self interacting with class interacting with culture, all of them interacting with each other, hierarchy being the link between them all, hierarchy also interacting with everything, blah, 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 big four thing, triarchy, the big trinity of fictional ideas, class, self, and culture. And it's like, okay, but I can't solve this. How would you solve the delusion of self? Honestly, the only real way would be something I cannot suggest, and also not a political answer to the question. You can't really solve your dialectal nature of yourself in any real way that is universally applicable. And I've been trying to find a solution, but it's not really that easy, really. Almost like self-alienation will always exist, and I'm gonna start being a nihilist like C-Sect about everything and being a pessimist. I'm already a nihilist, Kierkegaardism is a nihilistic philosophy, still being narcissistic and calling myself a philosopher, but yeah, it's still a nihilistic philosophy at heart. But I'm not a pessimist, and I think that's the main distinguishing thing between me and all of these guys is I'm not pessimistic about this. I still think, well, first of all, literally, I still think there's a solution to some of these issues, blah, 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 if you want to go by the non-philosophical meaning of pessimism. But also, in philosophy, I don't believe in negative value. I think it's a contradiction. You can't be pessimistic nihilist. You can't be anti-natalist and a nihilist unless you're just doing it for political reasons. You can't be Nietzschean or a nihilist. Nihilism is its own thing. It's complete. I'm not a radical nihilist because I'm not metaphysical and blah, 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 blah. But just overall pessimism in general in its sense of doomerism, which is what people usually mean by pessimism. Doomerism is so stupid because what's it gonna do? Oh, you're gonna cry about not being able to solve all these issues. You're gonna be depressed and lonely about it. You're gonna do nothing about it. Have you tried just existing? Yeah, you don't need a fucking solution to all your problems just to live, dude. Just do whatever you want. Yeah, I think that's mostly all I have to say about all of this. I might try to find a solution to cultural dialect and individual dialect and class dialect or whatever. Kind of difficult, you know. Ugh, so difficult. Yeah, whatever. Yeah. I just wish there was actually a way to get creative about this stuff, because I don't know. Silence.